Get your Sioux City sarsaparilla and Guy's potato chips ready. We are going on a trip to the Midwest. October 16th, 1965, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. A fisherman at Lake Winnebago at Menominee Park came across a grisly discovery about 29 feet off the east side of the breakwater, that of the body of a deceased young man. The resident would run to find a nearby phone, where he would call police, who used a fire department boat to tow the body to shore. Because of the condition of the body, an identity was unable to be made for 3 days. But when it finally was, it came as sort of a shock, as the young man was identified as 18-year-old Stephen Kappell, a freshman at Wisconsin State University in Oshkosh, which is today part of the University of Wisconsin system. But before we get to the details of the remains, we need to go back and look at the last few strange days in Stephen's life. As mentioned, Stephen was a freshman for the university where he intended to play football as a backup center, or all-around offensive lineman. He was 6'1" and 210 pounds, and was an avid fisherman and hunter. But in that freshman year, he went through some heartbreak, like a lot of young people do, as a girl he was crazy about dumped him in April, some half a year before his death. In response to this, he went through a rough spell, where he was arrested for stealing a car and several items of merchandise. His father would later state that it was a cry for help. But thankfully, Stephen, after being depressed a bit, soon got over the breakup and got back to his old self. That summer, he would spend with his family before enrolling back into school that September, where he loved college and planned on becoming a teacher. When he returned during enrollment, he met a girl named Jill Falk, and the two began to chat, and before long, they were dating. This is when things would start to get, well, weird. First, Stephen started to get moody, and he was disappointed he did not make the football team, which Jill found odd, since his senior year of high school, he was named honorable mention as all-conference tackle, yet failed to make the team in a backup role. However, she would eventually introduce him to her family 2 days before he disappeared. The following day, just 1 day before he would vanish, a strange scenario would unfold. As the two were going to class, they disagreed on what route to take, and Stephen would grab Jill by the arm and tugged at her to follow him. This caused her to trip down some stairs. The local paper would even record that he forced her to walk to class by pulling her down a flight of steps. Later that day, Jill would write him a note scolding him for being pushy. Stephen's best friend was with him when she delivered the note, and Stephen turned around and left without saying anything. Jill would tell this best friend that something was bothering Stephen, but he would not talk to her about it. This best friend, Timothy St. Alban, would chase after Stephen, but he kept walking. The next day, Stephen did call Jill to apologize for tugging her and met her at her dorm room and gave her 4 letters and a book of Sigmund Freud, saying the book would help her understand his behavior. Freud's theory of personality argues that interaction between 3 parts of the mind, the ID, ego, and superego, are the cause of human behavior. It's unsure why he decided to give her this book, but it gets stranger. People who seen Stephen that day, from his friend or roommate, all reported he was in a depressed state. He would leave his dorm about 5:30 and met Jill for dinner, and he would ask her if she had read the letters yet, and she replied no, which I find odd. He would leave an hour later at 6:30, and she would then read the letters. To her surprise, Stephen expressed feelings of unworthiness, while also sharing his strong feelings he had for Jill. After this, he would disappear for a couple of days. His best friend Timothy would actually report him missing to the headmaster just 2 days later. When they went to his dorm, they found a Bible that had been left open, which may have been a coincidence, but they also found a partially completed speech by Stephen about knowing thyself. That same day, his ex-girlfriend, the one that dumped him in April, received a letter from Stephen she described as jumbled, where he talked about his new girlfriend and how nice she was. He also put a picture of her, as well as a note that she had given him days prior. The letter also allegedly contained statements where Stephen said he was going away again, and this time, I know where I'm headed. That evening, he left his dorm room and was never seen alive again, which is all pretty strange, right? Well, fast forward 18 days later, and his body would be pulled out of the lake. So, with this background, the theory is obvious, right? It had to be suicide. But his friends would dispute this and state that Stephen would never do that. However, it's not uncommon for friends and family to deny that their loved one would commit suicide, but in this case, they actually had a point. But we have to go back to the beginning, when his body was recovered, to get the description of the remains. It's here the story makes an even more bizarre turn, because when Stephen's body was recovered from the water, he was found naked and brutally beaten, and left with 2 black eyes. The coroner stated he had been hit with a blunt instrument, but he couldn't rule out that it had came from fist. It appeared Stephen had been in some sort of a scuffle. Even worse, cloth bindings were used to tie his ankles, knees, and wrists together. These bindings left 18 inches of space between the 2 wrists and were knotted with a granny-style knot, a type of knot known to release unpredictably. The bindings that held his wrist did come loose during the removal of the body from the water. A size 38 athletic belt, commonly used by the football team, was also attached to a 12-inch diameter, 30-pound rock which was tied to his legs. It's because of these facts the suicide was now ruled out. There was just no way he could have tied himself in such a manner. The police chief speculated he was murdered in the city, maybe even on the shoreline, not far from where the body was found. Authorities would also find a depression near the sailboat launch site where the heavy rock had been taken from. Now, I hate to keep saying this, but this case gets stranger still, because the police chief's speculation about being murdered nearby would be proven wrong. This was due to the coroner's report, which showed sediment including silts and clay packed with a paste-like black muck inside the victim's bronchial tubes, which sadly confirmed Stephen died in an absolutely awful way, drowning while being restrained. But sediments would be collected from the body of water where Stephen was found, and they did not match what was found in his lungs, meaning Stephen had been drowned somewhere else, then moved to this location for some bizarre reason. In addition, his left eye, cheek, and neck were all swollen, along with his upper right shoulder and wrist, which were bruised. Strangely, no bruising was found under the bindings. The coroner suggested he was probably unconscious when he hit the water and inhaled several times the black muck from the bottom of the lake. An investigation soon began, and detectives would speak to his best friend Timothy, who told police that a paperboy had told him Stephen had been seen with some men that night, and he described the situation as not handling him too nicely. Timothy would allege that the police refused to follow up on this lead. They did, however, search the lake with divers, scoured the shoreline, and did house-to-house interviews, and checked out the campus. Boy Scouts, civil defense, personal, and law enforcement searched several acres. They also dragged the lake. One student who remained anonymous was eventually found, and he was the last one confirmed to have seen Stephen, and he told police that Stephen told him he was leaving campus. The student tried to talk him out of it, but Stephen ignored him and walked away. The rumor mill began to swirl, and many said that Stephen's girlfriend Jill had dumped him, and he went out on a boat and tied a rock to himself and jumped in. But why strip down, beat yourself up, and throw the rock in? Also, the sediments kind of ruled out suicide. But at the coroner's inquest, 6 jurors were set to determine his cause of death. The coroner stated he could have been conscious when hitting the water and then was knocked out by something he struck inside the water. They also found medication, something like a time-delay cold capsule, which may have put him to sleep. The bindings also came from a pair of khaki pants, which traces of similar trousers were found at the boat launch, although these pants were very common at the time. The pants size were checked though, and they were too big for Stephen. Regardless, the town officials described Stephen as a disturbed young man with suicidal tendencies. They even pressured his best friend Timothy to admit it was a suicide, which he did not do. The jury would find that there was not enough evidence either way to show murder or suicide, and recommended that the case stay open. But the case was never solved, and here is the really sad part. Over half a century later, his siblings would reach out to the police to inquire about the status of the case. She was stunned to hear they didn't have a case on anyone named Stephen Kappell. Apparently, in spite of the fact that the original jury requested the case be left open and further investigated, the district attorney ordered the evidence to be destroyed. The police were forced to start over, and they had no evidence, and most of the original witnesses were deceased, or at best, trying to recall something that happened 56 years ago. So of course, police haven't made much headway. They've been left to look up old newspaper articles to get as much details as possible. There's not much in the way of theories. Some do speculate a cover-up by the original authorities because they were worried that it would drive down enrollment. Some speculate that it could have been related to the football team. Maybe he got in a fight with another player. Some have even brought up he may have been bullied, or maybe it could have been some kind of hazing thing that went too far, or maybe even a violent prank, or maybe even a conflict that came from his current or past girlfriend. Others speculated gang activity where they staged the scene to look like a suicide, or that he was killed and hid in a sailboat for 18 days until the suspect finally got the opportunity to dump the body, while others have suggested a serial killer. What is certain now is it was a murder, which is a really huge coincidence when you consider how depressed Stephen was in his last days. Sims, North Dakota, now a ghost town, was once a small settlement founded in 1883. The coal brought a population of more than 1,000 people at one point, but like a lot of coal towns, the coal eventually runs out and everyone abandons, and that's what happened here, because by 1910, only 86 people remained, and the population would fluctuate over the century, with the last home being occupied in 2005, and that was vacant and removed by 2012. This was the last citizen of this now forgotten town. Or is it? That's where our mystery begins, because according to locals around the area, one resident remains, that of a former pastor's wife who died between 1916 and 1918, 26-year-old Bertha Dordel, where she is still known to haunt the old parsonage, wandering the rooms and playing the organ. According to records, in 1884, the Lutheran congregation built a church and parsonage, the place where the minister lives, and around 1912 or 1913, the minister at the time lived in the small building with his wife and 2 kids. It's at this point his wife Bertha would become ill. Her sister came out of state to help her, but the lady sadly died. The minister then strangely married his sister-in-law and left town. Fast forward about 20 years to around the mid-30s, and that's when things became creepy, as one minister after another would up and leave the parsonage and North Dakota, after some ghostly things were said to have happened in the home, such as the second-story windows of the parsonage opening and closing by themselves at random times, and strangest of all, an organ that no longer even sat in the church would play music. Pastor Carl Nelson's wife Olga would report in the 1930s seeing a gray shape upstairs, while also seeing the well's pump handle move up and down by itself. And for what it's worth, this wasn't something that was said in jest. The population was mainly Norwegians who immigrated to the US in the late 19th century, and a lot of them believed in ghosts. In fact, would grow so concerned by the ghost in 1938, they sent a letter to the area bishop and pleaded with him to come and do something about it. Unfortunately, there's no record regarding what this bishop done. Another claim came from a lay preacher, which is basically someone who has not been ordained, who would report speaking to the ghost. However, it was the ministers' wives that seemed to be bothered the most, as they were the ones that would report the majority of strange happenings, and it was they that always pressured the husband to leave the small parsonage and go to another town. For whatever reason, the ghost never seemed to bother male bachelors, or really any men at all, and that could be because the ministers were out quite often during the day doing things to help the community. Women always seemed to be the target, such as one young woman who spent the night there and woke up to find, to her surprise, someone had came up and placed an extra blanket on her while she slept, yet no one had entered the small building. So is this place really haunted by the deceased wife of a minister? So much so that it caused numerous ministers to leave the church and town? Or is it possible the women that lived in this area were just looking for an excuse to leave town? July 1948, Churubusco, Indiana. 2 citizens, Ora Blue and Charlie Wilson, would go fishing at a lake that eventually would become known as Folk Lake. The land was actually owned by a farmer named Gale Harris, and it's on this summer day that this little town would get on track to becoming famous, because Ora and Charlie would leave the lake later and stop and talk to Gale and tell him of something crazy they had seen. While at the lake, they had seen an enormous snapping turtle. Gale was initially skeptical, but shortly after this, he and a friend, a reverend, spotted the beast while repairing his barn's roof. They shrugged it off until the next day, when it resurfaced again. This time, they took a rowboat out to look, and within minutes, both men spotted the turtle on their respective side of the boat. They soon realized that they were in fact looking at the same turtle. That's how big it was. Word soon spread around town, but this was a different time when things moved much slower. It wouldn't be until early next year when a reporter from Fort Wayne sent the story out on wire services did the turtle now known as the Beast of Busco would become famous. Soon, it was hard to tell fact from fiction, as rumors spread that the turtle was known to eat cattle that came near the lake. Curious sightseers began to invade the private land to try and find the turtle, which resulted in the state police being called in. Many doubted such a turtle could exist, as Charlie claimed that it was upwards of 500 pounds and 6 feet wide, which would be the record. It was also said to have moss on its back at least 2 inches thick, so many attempts by Gale was made to capture it, and they all failed. First, a deep sea diver came to the pond, but the wrong equipment was delivered to the farm, and the helmet began to leak, so the search was called off. They also tried a trap of stakes and chicken wire, and were able to trap the beast for a short while before it escaped. Gale at one point would even try to drain the lake by pumping water into an area sealed off by dam. However, the muck-covered lake bottom began to take a toll on the pump and tractor, and it broke down. Gale then got appendicitis, and by the time he was well, the lake had refilled. He just caught off the whole thing. But although people were dismissive of the claims, it wasn't actually the first time it had been spotted. Records showed that 50 years before, in 1898, the original owner of the farm, Oscar Falk, would report seeing the giant turtle living there as well. He had told a few people, but it never caused the attention that it gathered now. Sightings continued though, and at one point, 200 people who were visiting the lake would spot the beast as it appeared on the surface in an attempt to catch a duck that was being used as a lure, as well as a sighting in 1949 when a man named Dale Weingartner filmed the turtle from a tree. He showed the film to 2 locals who said the turtle was clearly visible in the film and was as large as eyewitnesses claimed. Weingartner then allegedly sold this film, and it was never recovered. However, this hasn't stopped the town from embracing it, and they now have Turtle Days Festival every year, which includes a parade, carnival, and turtle races, along with a small concrete statue of a turtle that sits on the sidewalk at the main intersection. But just what did Aura and Charlie see? Was it really a giant turtle? Curiously, after Charlie reported the sightings, a local resident named Rusty Reed, who was the turtle expert, said the whole thing was a hoax, pointing out that Charlie Wilson was known to tell tall tales. The story, according to Rusty, should have ended there, but since it happened on the farm of Gale Harris, a man known to be gullible, he ran with the story and made his own claims of seeing this enormous creature. Rusty would further note that if a snapping turtle made it as far as north as Indiana, it was probably large, but not as large as a dining room table or top of a car as some reports indicated. He also noted that no one actually ever seen its body surface, only its head and neck, and part of its shell, and since the alligator snappers have heads that are way out of proportion to their bodies, he believed this caused people to overestimate the size. In the past 60 years, it has never been spotted again, leading many to believe it found an underground channel and left the lake and went somewhere else, especially since another giant turtle was spotted just a year later in Black Oak, Indiana, some 125 miles away. Reed suggested it was doubtful since the lake had several feet of muck on the bottom and there are no known underground channels. He instead believed that the turtle suffocated in the murky depths amid Gale's attempt to drain the lake. (1882), the Dakota Territory. A man named Eugene Butler would stroll into the town of Niagara, now present-day North Dakota. He had been born and raised in Royalton, New York, near Buffalo. It's here the recluse, who never married, would maintain the property on his own, except for the summer when he hired farmhands to maintain his land during the summer months. Otherwise, he would go all out to avoid contact with his neighbors and only went into town for business purposes in nearby Leelanau. And although he was seen as a quirky recluse, it would get a little worse because Butler began to show lots of signs of mental illness. He began to suffer hallucinations as he thought people were chasing him, and he thought that all the widows and old maids in the area wanted to marry him. He also thought that men were forcing him to dress up in the middle of the night and take long walks and horseback rides. And it got worse in 1906 when he began riding his horse at night throughout the countryside, screaming at the top of his lungs, which of course scared the other residents. It didn't take long until he was considered a public nuisance, and town authorities would admit him to the North Dakota State Hospital in Jamestown, where he was looked after by a Dr. W.M. Hotchkiss. While living at the asylum, he would tell the doctor of his fears of the supposed invisible figures who had followed him to the asylum, as well as the fear of having his photo taken, believing the camera would suck his soul out and kill him. Despite the sad torture of his mental illness, he showed no violent or homicidal tendencies. Another doctor would record that Butler was a man of small stature, a gentleman to women, and was fond of attending the hospital dances. He even fell in love with a nurse. However, just 6 years after being admitted, Eugene Butler, now 63 years old, would pass away. His estate would be divided between his relatives, and by now, you know this channel well enough to know that this is not the whole story, because 2 years later in 1915, the town would send out workmen to tear down the Butler farm with the purpose of renovating it. One of these men was digging a cellar underneath the house when he made a gruesome discovery. He spotted human skeletons buried close to the foundation. All of them had their skulls crushed by what looked like a sharp instrument. 2 of the victims had even suffered broken legs. Initially, there was a theory that 5 of these remains belonged to a family consisting of 2 women, probably housekeepers, and their children, but nobody in the neighborhood could recall a family ever disappearing in the county. People then began to speculate that maybe the remains of Eugene Butler's relatives who had came in to visit, but this would also be ruled out, as police were later able to confirm the skeletons all belonged to young men, one of them being between 15 and 18, and another one that had a crooked nose. Detectives could not identify the individuals though, and suggested they were vagrants employed as farmhands by Butler, which explained why nobody noticed their disappearance. The theory was that he had probably murdered them because they were going to steal money from his house, which he left a lot laying about, or that he just didn't want to pay them at the end of the season, so he killed them. It was also noted there were no traces of clothes of any kind, suggesting he buried them nude and burned the clothes, which might lead to another theory that the murders were sorta like that of Wayne Gacy. Maybe these had been sexual encounters. He even went through the efforts of building a trap door to dispose of the bodies, removing 3 bottom stones from the house's foundation, then used black dirt and red clay subsoil to cover up the burial places. The murders were believed to have occurred over a 4 to 5 year period. There was only one lead in the history of the investigation, when a wealthy farmer in Minnesota, Leo Urbanski, had his lawyer write the state attorney and suggest that his brother John Urbanski could be a victim. John had written to his brother in 1902, stating he was working for a bachelor in the city of Niagara, and the letter's postmark was from Lattimore, where Butler conducted his business. Strangely enough, in 2016, detectives did dig out the code case and ask anyone if they had information to please call the tip line. Sadly, the original remains were stolen by various townfolk, so there is no way to DNA test, and to this day, nobody knows the identities of the 6 victims that were killed by the man that would become known as the Great Plains Butcher. October 17th, 2000, 40-year-old Regina Bos of Lincoln, Nebraska, who went by the name Gina, would go to a local pub called Duggan's. Gina was a musician, and she could often be found participating in the open mic night at the pub, and that's just what she was doing this night, as the many patrons who also attended noted she was in good spirits and having a good time. One of these patrons was even her ex-husband, who would speak to her before leaving around 10 p.m. A few hours later, around 1 a.m., she would tell her friends she was leaving to pick up her boyfriend Michael Johnson at his residence and then go home to be with her children for the rest of the night. She would then pick up her guitar and leave. Her boyfriend waited a while before he finally fell asleep, but he woke up at midnight and realized she had still not made it home. He would end up paging her multiple times, but she had forgot her pager at home, and the sound of it going off woke up her children, and when they got up, they also realized Gina had still not made it home. They would call their father and their maternal grandparents, but neither of them knew where she was. That morning, around 6:30 a.m., her boyfriend would also call the children, only to find out Gina had still not made it. He now knew something was wrong and called the police at 6:38 a.m., who then began their search. And it would be later that day, Michael and some of Gina's friends found her vehicle parked across the street from the pub, where it seemed like she had never even left. Police did notice the trunk was slightly open, and inside was her guitar and sheet music. Her purse, however, was not at the scene. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood or DNA evidence, but it was believed she had not left of her own accord. Detectives began a search on foot with cadaver dogs, which led to nothing. Detectives would then begin to run down leads, but there just wasn't anything. She had been married twice before, but both marriages ended amicably, and there was no hard feelings nor motive. They then began to retrace her steps the day of her disappearance. They found out that Gina had attended a baby shower earlier that day before going home, where she would then greet her children and boyfriend Michael. She spent time with the kids, who were 15, 13, and 11. Then, her and Michael would head to the pub, but on their way, her and Michael got into a disagreement, and he decided he didn't want to go and asked Gina to take him home. He then asked her to pick him up on her way back so he could go home with her. So again, detectives hit a brick wall. They believed Gina was taken by someone she knew and trusted, as opposed to being forced by a stranger without anybody noticing. It was closing time when she left, and someone outside would have seen something. And with that, we have another bad break. The pub had video cameras, but the pub owner had forgotten to turn them on. Michael would be the first suspect, obviously, but he seemed to be really broken up by her disappearance. He was then questioned and took a lie detector test and was ruled out fairly quickly. Some of her family still had doubts about him, but police were sure he was not the one responsible. And by 2018, a retired detective who had worked on the case stated he believed he knew what had happened to Gina and that she was most likely murdered. But detectives never had enough evidence to pursue. This seems to match Gina's family's theory that someone she knew approached her and asked to speak to her for a second. This person then lured her to their car and kidnapped her. The open trunk could have been caused by a button on her car keys, or she just didn't have the opportunity to shut it all the way. Bedford, Iowa, August 11th, 1887. A strange story would top the front covers of the local newspaper, the Bedford Times, which reported that local resident Lee Corder had encountered a flying serpent. He described this cryptid as writhing and twisting, with protruding eyes and a forked tongue. Great scales, which glistened in the sunlight, covered its huge body, which appeared to be flat and nearly a foot in width. The beast seemed to fly and land with a thud in Corder's cornfield, where he watched in awe as it eventually flew away. If this was a one-off, you could totally dismiss it, but 3 years later, in Independence, Iowa, over 250 miles away, there would be several reports of a creature with a monstrous head with horns, a mouth like an alligator's that was also green and covered with scales. And there's also been modern sightings, one where a woman who only used her first name, Megan, would record in 2005 witnessing a flying dragon while driving with her husband in Burlington, Iowa. She described it as a 10-foot-long snake-like creature with bat-like wings and a head like a seahorse. As far as what was really seen back in these early reports, one theory is again just bad journalism. The papers from the 19th century were known to print outrageous stories to pump up their sales, but cryptozoologists have suggested that it may have not been a dragon, but instead a pterodactyl, which we have discussed in other videos before. Others speculate that it could have been a thunderbird, which are giant bird-like animals that were reported by the early settlers along with the many Native American tribes. February 15th, 1926. In the town of Dickinson, North Dakota, residents of this small town would be in for a shock when they heard the news that sisters Ambrosina Hegele and Anacleta Huwiller, members of St. Joseph's Parish, had passed away unexpectedly from unknown causes. The St. Joseph's Hospital was known as a beacon of hope in this community, that the nuns were dedicated to serving those sick and in need. So when this happened, it was really a blow to the community. Although detectives did not know how they died, they were able to rule out foul play and thought it was just an odd coincidence. But the next morning, Sister Fedele Donati was pronounced dead. Now, there were 3 dead nuns in just 48 hours. As the town tried to come to terms with these losses, they would be hit again, because 3 days later, Sister J.C.R. Sickwart would die, followed by Sister Secunda Hackle 3 days later. In total, 5 nuns had all died within a week. The community was now in turmoil and demanded answers. However, there would never be one. Detectives and medical professionals did investigate, but they were baffled. They at first thought that poisonous fumes were responsible, as the week before, there had been staining of woodwork in the hospital's new wing, and 2 of the sisters, in fact, fell ill while inspecting the work, while the other 3 had become sick in their basement apartments where the fumes may have settled. However, this was quickly ruled out when they discovered no poisonous substances were even used in the woodwork samples. Detectives had to start over, so they looked at their last hours. Each one had died from similar symptoms. Each one had gradually become weaker, apathetic in their demeanor, and within hours, lost consciousness. Each instance led to desperate efforts by doctors to retrieve them, yet they all failed. It would not be until a month later that a break came via one of the autopsies. The medical examiner found signs of an unknown inflammation. The brains were swollen, and the presence of lesions now showed a potential reason for the deaths. The report concluded a rare inflammation of the brain stemming from an unknown illness was the cause. This would be widely accepted to most, but many still wondered about the whole thing. It wasn't long before rumors about the hospital popped up, but the story would eventually lose interest and life moved on. But 8 years later to the date, in 1934, another nun, Sister Hildebrandis Fleury, succumbed to pneumonia. The nun had been in frail health ever since the first 5 nuns had perished years ago, leading many to speculate she had also contracted whatever they had and survived, albeit eventually passing away from it 8 years later. Historians, as well as medical experts, have researched this case in the decades since, and one big problem is the potential diseases and conditions were not as widely known or understood by the medical profession in the 20s and 30s. They did not have advanced diagnostic tools, and their knowledge was limited. However, theories have been proposed, and one of these was that it was a brain inflammation caused by a lesser-known virus at that time. But maybe the best theory was the one suggested by earlier investigators. The sheriff's department believed the sisters had all been exposed to an environmental toxin or chemical substance, although a list of those specific agents were unknown in that era. The biggest question is Sister Hildebrandis. Her death, which came 8 years later, was it connected to the original ones? That's never been confirmed. But if it was, that of course means the epidemic had a lingering presence. But close to a century later, we still have no real idea of what caused the nuns to pass. July 18th, 2002, Oklahoma City would be greeted with some news that was not as somber as some of the mysteries we have covered thus far, when the auto storage lot, known as Puckett's, would get a little dose of paranormal activity in their parking lot. An employee who was monitoring the company's surveillance monitor would notice a transparent female in overalls floating around the wrecking yard. Somehow, the local TV affiliate heard of this story and did a short segment on it, and it was not taken too seriously. However, Puckett's would be in for a surprise when they received a phone call from the Martin family, and here's where things get creepy. 18 days previously, on June 30th, 33-year-old mother of twins, Tracey Martin, tragically died after falling asleep at the wheel of her truck and crashing. That red truck was then hauled back to Puckett's lot by their wrecker service. Now her family, after seeing the ghost video on the news, believed this was their Tracey, as Tracey had been wearing her favorite overalls during the crash. They believed that it was Tracey trying to send them a message, while others cited the spirit was looking for her crashed vehicle, which sat on the front lot. The story picked up a lot of press at the time, as many paranormal researchers quickly concluded this was a real authentic paranormal encounter. However, skeptics were also ready to jump in with a much more believable scenario. They suggested what you were really seeing is something known as Pepper's ghost trick, which is an illusion widely used in entertainment purposes. It involves a stage arranged into two rooms or areas, one the audience can see, and a second room that is hidden, and a plate of glass is placed somewhere in the main room at a 45-degree angle that reflects the view of the other room towards the audience, probably most famous for its use in Disneyland's Haunted Mansion ballroom. Skeptics would recreate their own junkyard video using this effect and recorded it with a Radio Shack low-light camera, a G.I. Joe, a black string, a flashlight, and plexiglass. The result was an almost exact match. However, it has still been documented on numerous shows, and many still believe it was a real encounter, pointing out that it would have been a lot of trouble to go through for a wrecking yard to pull this hoax. What would be the reason for making such an elaborate illusion? Furthermore, what about the Martin family that lost Tracey in a wreck? Surely they wouldn't be involved. And finally, one more argument against the Pepper's ghost trick. Someone eventually called the news station and claimed responsibility for the hoax, claiming they used wire, ladders, and fishing poles, which would mean the lot had to be in on it or the caller was lying, because Puckett's sent out an employee to look for the ghost right after it popped up on screen, and they found nothing. August 23rd, 1992, New Buffalo, Michigan. A gruesome discovery would be made on Kruger Road in Berrien County, as a passerby noticed a black plastic bag about 15 feet off the side of a rural road. Inside was that of a nude body of a deceased individual. This woman had been bound with twine and wrapped up with various materials, such as a sheet, a towel, and 2 garbage bags. The investigators were not surprised, as it was right off the freeway exit, and bodies had been dumped here before. But what really stood out to investigators was this was not your typical victim. Instead of a younger female that we typically hear in these stories, this woman was somewhere between the ages of 65 and 75. Her hands had been cut off, and her dentures were missing, which obviously meant whoever had killed her took the time to remove anything that could identify her. She also had an appendectomy scar and a broken spine, although that is not what killed her. Investigators were stumped. They had no idea who this woman was or why she had been killed, and where to start. But they did catch one break. The towel that had been used to help bind her, that wasn't one you would typically see in a home. Instead, it appeared to have come from some kind of facility, such as a care facility for the elderly or disabled. Specifically, these very intelligent and hard-working detectives were confident that that towel, and thus the lady, known as Betty the Bag Lady, had came from northern Illinois or northern Indiana. The case did go cold after this though, until August 2020, when it was announced by investigators in the case that they were pursuing leads and thought they may have found potential family members in Ireland. The DNA Doe Project believed, in addition to having family in Ireland, she may have a connection to anyone with the last name O'Donoghue, Donahue, McDonough, and O'Brien living in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. Furthermore, she had DNA matches in England and New Zealand, and although detectives have got a lot closer to identifying her, they still have not come up with a name. Theories are just as open. Some suggest pension fraud, where someone might have wanted to live off of her pension, but needed to do away with her before she was discovered dying of natural causes. Some suspect a family member took her out of the group home and killed her, maybe even her husband. Others suggest an employee at the facility could have been responsible. In the time we have looked at these missing person cases on this channel, we have come across people from all walks of life, but from what I can find, there's only been one police chief that ever vanished, and this is his story. The year was 1985 in Hinckley Township, Ohio, where we find the 47-year-old police chief, Mel Wiley. Now Mel had an interesting career path up to police chief. First of all, his true desire was to become a novelist, but like many people, sometimes these things don't pan out. Although to Mel's credit, he did eventually have one book of poetry published. He started off in the Army, and strangely enough, was stationed at the atomic testing site in Nevada, where his work there has never been disclosed. But he was involved in an accident at the test site that left him with radiation burns on his arms and torso, which led him to always wearing long-sleeve shirts because he was self-conscious about the scarring. Following the Army, he graduated from BYU and went back home to Ohio, where he married. He then got a job with the FBI as a fingerprint technician before moving to take a position at the Hinckley Police Department, and pay must have not been great there because he also worked as a private investigator and crime beat reporter on the side, which seems like that would have been a conflict of interest. Regardless, he rose up the ranks. In 1982, he would be offered the job of police chief. Now Mel was known as a friendly and helpful person, but he was intensely private, and it made it hard for people to get to know him. And it was even worse when he suffered some tragedies. First, his younger brother died of cancer, and the two had been very close. Then Mel's wife of 17 years filed for divorce after he had been busted having an affair with a married woman, as well as the bombshell discovery that he had been writing erotic tales about women in the area, which came to light when these stories were found in the police department trash bin. He was devastated, but eventually recovered. Soon the married woman he had had the affair with also broke it off, and Mel was alone again. But he soon began dating, and again, maybe not making the best choices, he actually started a relationship with the ex-wife of a fellow officer, which of course caused strained relations at the department. But this woman, Judy, and Mel were said to be happy together, and here's where things got weird. On July 27th, 1985, Mel left work and went to eat at a restaurant, running into people he knew who later said he was in good spirits. He then left to Judy's and told her he wouldn't be spending the night cause he had to get up early and that he was going to meet an old friend whom he never named. These two were going to go for a swim in Cleveland's Edgewater Park, located on the shores of Lake Erie. He stated he was going to get swimming trunks at Walmart beforehand. Now Judy was immediately bewildered because Mel didn't like swimming and he was extremely uncomfortable about his scars, but she let it be. Before leaving, he told her he would call her the following day after he was done visiting his friend, but the next day, Mel never called. And then by Sunday, Mel's mother also became alarmed because he had told her he would call her. But since this was the 80s, people did not stay in contact constantly, so they were not super alarmed yet. Then Monday rolled around, and Mel did not show up for work, which was very uncharacteristic for the typically reliable police chief. And strangely, no one had still stopped by his place to check on him, or had even tried to call him. But what finally set off alarm bells was when Mel's 1980 beige Toyota Corolla station wagon was found locked and abandoned at Edgewater Park. Mel cherished this vehicle because his brother had left it to him. Park officials ran the license plate and were surprised to learn it belonged to the chief of police. From here, stories vary. Some say the park officials notified police immediately. Another version states they waited a full day to see if anyone returned before calling police. Regardless, by Wednesday, police did know, and they had examined the vehicle. They found Mel's clothing on the passenger seat, as well as a pack of cigarettes, the brand he smoked, along with his keys and wallet, which contained his driver's license, credit cards, badge, and $15. There was also suntan lotion and a beach towel. Lynn Keller, the former police chief that had stepped down allowing Mel to take his position, would help with the investigation, and he was immediately struck by one thing: Mel's driver's seat position. Mel was 5'11", yet the seat had been pulled forward as if someone else much shorter had been driving. Despite this inconsistency, there was no signs of a struggle in or around the car. Another odd thing that stood out was the timeline. Mel was last heard from on Friday after leaving Judy's house, yet his vehicle was spotted by rangers no earlier than Monday morning. and it had not been at the lake that weekend. The ranger knew this because he had patrolled that area. Detectives then went to Mel's house and noted several of his long-sleeve shirts were missing, as well as his unfinished manuscript to a murder mystery novel and a book of poetry. The refrigerator was also empty, except for one partial jar of mayonnaise. Most notably, he had taken a couple $1,000s with him, yet his beloved model train collection and his 2 guns were left behind. Interestingly, he also left several days of food and water for his cats, who were still inside. A note was also found in his handwriting with Greyhound bus departure times from Cleveland to Fort Ord, California, where he had been stationed for part of his duration in the Army. There had also been a train schedule laid out as well. In spite of all this evidence pointing to Mel leaving, detectives assumed he had drowned, either accidentally or intentionally. A massive search was carried out by Cleveland Police Department Ports and Harbors Unit, the Coast Guard, and Ohio State Parks and Watercraft, but not one sign of Mel popped up, and his body never washed ashore. Yet Mel's girlfriend and family would not accept that he staged his own disappearance, citing the unnecessary drama when he could simply pick up and move away and maintain contact with them. Furthermore, he had been acting normal in previous weeks, even cutting up and joking around, and he showed no signs of depression. However, detectives would search his office at the headquarters. One dispatcher had the bright idea to look at the typewriter ribbon and transcribe what she found, and she actually made a big discovery. Mel had recently written a letter to an unnamed married woman whom he had had an affair, and in the letter, he spoke of his frustration with where he was in life and had a desire to leave it all behind. The contents of this letter have never been fully released, but one key part was, and it read, "All that seems to exist for me here are the day-to-day reminders of the things in the past 20 years that, once started, either did not work out or that never did have the potential for working out, no matter how much time would go by. By the time you read this, I'll be 2,400 miles away. By the time you receive this, I will, in a sense, have gone away." However, despite all this evidence pointing to a fact he may have left, many still did not believe it. Would he possibly leave his mother in such a hurtful way right after she had lost another son to cancer? Why did he tell his former mistress instead of his girlfriend? Why did he leave behind $16,000, or about $45,000 in today's money, as well as his cats and the vehicle he loved? But there was one line in the letter that may change everything. He had also written, "Fortunately, or unfortunately, it's a one-way trip, so I'm told, with no possibility of ever returning." Was that a hint at suicide? Or did he have someone helping him leave, and he knew he could never return? Strangely, Officer David Yates would ultimately replace Mel as chief of police, and 10 days after taking office, he received an unsigned postcard from Canada that read, "Your editorial, Wiley's Mystery, was elementary. Try to improve." Some have wondered, was this Mel Wiley himself? The police department would eventually conclude he left town on his own and closed the case. Others still believe suicide, however, while some suggest a police cover-up. January 5th, 1981, Moore, Oklahoma. Tracey Neilson had a great day planned, as it was her 21st birthday. The young lady was a student at Oklahoma State University, where she intended to become a physical therapist. She had already met the love of her life, Jeff Neilson, to whom she had been married to for 5 months. He was in school at the University of Oklahoma to become a doctor. Tracey would head out that morning, where she had to go run some errands, and returned home sometime before noon. And since it was her birthday, she would receive multiple calls from family and friends, all wanting to tell her happy birthday. However, Tracey never answered those calls. Tracey seemed to be silent, and I imagine most of the birthday wishers assumed that she was out celebrating and thought nothing of it. But that evening, Jeff, after leaving class, would stop to pick up a birthday card and perfume for his wife, and around 5 p.m., he would walk into their apartment to find an utter nightmare. There lay Tracey's dead body across their bed. She had multiple stab wounds. Jeff called 911 immediately, who came to the scene to start their investigation. They soon discovered there had been no sign of forced entry, which set off alarm bells that Tracey most likely knew her killer, which of course, you can see where this is going. They immediately suspected Jeff. However, after checking out his alibi with the university, he was quickly ruled out, and investigators were back to square one. What really made the case even more difficult, though, was only one thing had been stolen from the apartment, and that was a simple keychain that spelled out Tracey's name. Detectives believed the killer had taken it as some sort of trophy. It would also appear Tracey had not been assaulted or violated in any other way, or at least that's never been released if so. However, at the apartment, they did discover something they hoped would lead to a break in the case, that of one fingerprint that did not belong to Jeff or Tracey. And being in the 80s, it was much harder to check fingerprints against numerous known felons, but they did try many and never found anything. As the means to cross-check fingerprints in a nationwide database become available, they did so, but still found nothing, meaning this person has never been arrested for any other crimes. The man was spotted by two neighbors, and he was described as being 25 to 35 and around 5'9" and 160 pounds, with dark hair and some facial hair and or sideburns, and a sketch was made. Unfortunately, the case went cold quickly, and there was no movement on it for decades, and this might be why, after 30 plus years in 2015, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation finally released a crucial piece of evidence in this case, that being a cable ticket book police had recovered. The last ticket showed a cable repairman had completed work at Tracey's apartment at 11:51 in the morning that she died, and considering nobody heard from her after that time, it could be the key clue to the entire investigation. The ticket showed whatever the repairman was called out for, he did complete. So if he finished it at 11:51, I would imagine he was at least there for 5 to 10 minutes before. So it's pretty likely he was responsible, or at the very least, he would have seen something. But obviously, detectives had one problem with this crucial piece of evidence. They were not able to find the owner of the ticket book, and that repairman has never been identified. And it's even more frustrating because the repairman initialed or wrote his name, as you can see here. There's been a huge debate on just what these initials say, and another part of the problem is it's just a generic form, one that does not show a company name, so they're not even sure what cable company this man came from. And since companies change records, sell out, or buy out other companies, it makes the search even more complex. When this piece of evidence was made public in 2015, investigators commented they were now working under the theory that if these cable companies still exist, they may have been located out of state. However, they were also honest in the fact that they didn't have a lot of hope they could run down which one. They were more hopeful that a cable repairman who worked in the Moore area in the early 80s could come forward and help out with the investigation, but to this date, that hasn't happened, or at least, it's not been made public if they have. I was also able to find some sources that stated detectives did finally narrow it down to what they believe was a form from Southwestern Bell, now AT&T, but I don't think that's confirmed. In total, police have ran down 1,500 leads in the 40 plus years, and none of these have panned out. Of course, the main theories revolve around that cable ticket. Some question why a cable repairman would bother filling out a form that puts him at the scene of a murder, and then initial it on top of that, which leads to speculation that it was a fake repairman, and this would also explain why there was no forced entry. But the problem with this is, how would the fake repairman know a real repairman was scheduled to go to the apartment that day, assuming there was one scheduled to show up, because I'm not sure if Tracey would just allow a repairman in without an appointment, unless he was able to trick her somehow. I wasn't able to find out if Jeff confirmed that there had been an appointment made that day, but I assume that the police checked that out. It's also possible that this individual may have simply stole the cable repairman's book and found the address, or he may have even been a subcontractor from out of town. But the even bigger glaring problem with this is, why would a fake repairman leave a fake ticket? Is he really that thorough or committed to the act? Others speculate that she knew her killer and was possibly even having an affair with him, and the ticket was left as a red herring. And that brings up another question. Did the killer know it was her birthday? See, that's the problem with this ticket. It leaves so many questions. in the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska, stands the West Baptist Church, where between the years of 1920 and 1950, choir director Martha Paul ran the choir, and Martha, well, she was very strict about punctuality. If you wanted to be in the choir, you arrived on Wednesday night no later than 7:25, or you didn't participate. So knowing this, most members usually showed up around 7:15, and it's with that background that we encounter this strange mystery. Because on March 1st, 1950, a mix of things that would not usually happen would lead to what many call a miracle. Let me explain. To start that evening, Reverend Walter Klemple would stop by the church to light the furnace so the church would be warm by the time choir practice rolled around. He would then head home for dinner. A few hours later, his family would get ready for choir practice. Him and his wife Eunice planned to take their 18-month-old Marilyn with them. They typically showed up at 10 after 7, but that night, Marilyn would stain her dress, forcing Eunice to have to iron another one. And on top of this, the clock had been set back 5 minutes, so Eunice thought that they had enough time. In reality, she was running late and would not make it in time. Around that same time, the choir's accompanist, Marilyn, who was the daughter of the choir director Martha, had intended to go to church 30 minutes early, but was tired and laid down to take a short nap. She figured 15 minutes would not hurt, but she ended up oversleeping by half an hour. Martha was going to wake her up, but her father suggested letting her sleep a bit longer. A few blocks away, Herbert Kiff, who sang bass, got preoccupied with church business. He was apparently writing a letter to their denominational headquarters, where he planned to drop off the letter in a mailbox on his way to practice. He too would be late. While 18-year-old Lucille Jones, who sang in the choir, got hooked on a radio program which ran until 7:30, and she would be late, as well as the neighbor she had intended to stop and walk with. What was strange in this one was Lucille said she didn't even know why she had turned on the radio that evening, while 15-year-old LaDonna Vandergrift, who sang soprano, always arrived early, but this day, she was late because she was struggling with homework. 2 miles away, Regina Estes' car wouldn't start, and she had intended to take her sister with her. Another woman, named Ruth Schuster, normally arrived at 7:20 p.m. with her daughter Susan. However, she stopped by her mother's to help her prepare for a missionary meeting. While there, her brother, who was also a member, was taking care of his 2 sons because his wife was out of town. Ruth and her brother began talking and lost track of time and were late. Meanwhile, Joyce Black, who lived across the street from the church, was late because according to her, she had just been plain lazy and didn't want to get out in the cold. So I told you all this to get to the mystery, as Joyce, who lived right in front of the church, put off going until the last minute. She walked out at 7:27 to see the church explode and disintegrate in front of her eyes. The walls fell, and the heavy wooden roof crashed to the ground. The steeple was thrown to a nearby street. Many of the people in town heard and felt the explosion. All over the city, the lights went out, and windows shattered in the homes across the street. The radio station even got knocked off the air. One of the songbooks would even fly through the air and landed at a nearby home. Firefighters arrived shortly and put out the fire. Members began to panic, as they each all thought that the others had perished. But within half an hour, all 15 members had showed up, all realizing that they had all been late, which saved their lives. They speculated that it was a miracle, especially considering over a dozen people scattered throughout town had been late over some trivial thing. The odds of it being a coincidence seemed small. The explosion, for the record, was caused by a natural gas leak from an underground pipeline making contact with the fire in the church's furnace. The choir loft sat directly above it and would have no doubt killed them all. However, some question the odds that 15 members were all late for different reasons and speculate that it may have been some kind of elaborate insurance fraud plot. We have all heard of the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is a loosely defined region in the North Atlantic Ocean where all these mysterious disappearances of aircraft and ships have occurred. But what if I told you that Lake Michigan has their own triangle where mysterious disappearances, along with other weird things, takes place? One of the earliest documented disappearances comes from that of the Rouse Simmons, better known as the Christmas tree ship, which vanished while transporting Christmas trees on November 23, 1912. A message in a bottle would eventually wash ashore, which read, "Friday, everybody goodbye. I guess we are all through." During the night, the small boat washed overboard, leaking bad. Invald and Steve lost too. God help us. This wreck is not as mysterious, as it's pretty much confirmed now that it was sunk by a winter storm. However, it's the numerous ghost sightings that have been spotted over the past century along the ship's final route that links it to the odd paranormal part of the triangle. Then we move forward to 1921, when the Rosabelle was carrying a load of lumber to Benton Harbor when she would be found capsized. None of the sailors were nearby, and the lifeboat was missing. The curious thing was, during the initial investigation, the Coast Guard ruled that the ship could not have flipped over upside down unless it was hit by another ship. However, there were no other ships known to be in the area at the time, and nobody ever came forward to report an accident. The Coast Guard would then backpedal on their theory and basically state they had no idea how the ship had overturned, finally suggesting that it was possible that it was caused by a storm. But maybe the most bizarre disappearance, though, comes from the ship O.M. McFarland. In 1937, it was on its way to Port Washington, Wisconsin, when Captain George Donner went into his cabin. He left a message with the crew to wake him when they got near the port. About 3 hours later, as the ship got closer, the second mate would go to the captain's cabin and knock, yet he didn't come to the door. The crew waited a few minutes and would then try to open the door and found it locked. They assumed he had went to get a snack, so they went to look for him, but still did not find him. They were now concerned about the captain and possibly feared he had some kind of health issue, so they would proceed to break the door down to his cabin to find Captain Donner was not in bed. He wasn't in the cabin at all. A search would then be carried out all over the ship, and not one piece of evidence was ever found that could explain where Donner had went to. The really strange part about this one is Donner's cabin had to be locked from the inside, and Donner was too large to fit through the portholes in his room. He also had showed no signs of depression or suicidal thoughts in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. No sign of him was ever found. Then we go to June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501, which was carrying 55 passengers from New York to Seattle. Now on this night, the region was going through some severe thunderstorms, which caused some flights to move south to avoid them, or some turned back altogether. Flight 2501 continued, however, but they did eventually request at 11:13 p.m. to drop down to a cruising altitude of 2,500 feet. They did not ask why or state that they had an emergency, but it could be because there had been severe turbulence reported at higher altitudes, such as one aircraft that had experienced it a little earlier at 5,000 feet. Regardless, air traffic control declined the request, as there was other traffic already at that level, so the crew acknowledged and continued to soar at 3,500 feet. This would be the last time they were ever heard from. 10 minutes later, air traffic control on the other side of Lake Michigan, in Milwaukee, would report the flight was 10 minutes late. After another 10 minutes passed, other air traffic controllers would try contacting the flight, to no avail. Authorities were contacted and a massive search began, but with it being night and pretty rough conditions, the search found nothing. The lake bottom was eventually dragged with grappling hooks, which snagged nothing. Divers went down, sonars were used, but again, nothing. The logbook was eventually found, as well as a few aircraft fragments and body parts, which some were described as shredded. And if you're thinking this one is obviously caused by the weather, well, the Coast Guard actually believed upon reviewing what they could find that the plane had blown up in mid-air. However, the only thing investigators were certain of was that it hit the water hard, but it's strange that the wreck was never located. Then we move forward to July 3rd, 1998. Don Schaller and Don Rodriguez were flying a single-engine jet towards Traverse City, Michigan, where they intended to participate in an air show. Schaller would radio at 6 p.m. when he was 27 miles away from Cherry Capital Airport, where he had departed from, and was also planning to return to. Soon after this, the flight disappeared from radar. Coast Guard helicopters were quickly deployed, and then was followed by a massive search over land and water, but no sign of the crash was ever found. It is believed to have landed in the lake, but no one knows why. The weather was calm, both men were experienced pilots, the plane was in good condition, and it was equipped with parachutes and ejection seats. There was no emergency call, no sign of the crash was ever found. But disappearances aren't the only strange thing that happens here. There's also just weird, unexplained phenomena, like on July 12, 1883, when the wooden tugboat named Mary McLean would witness something really strange. They would note, around 6 p.m., large blocks of ice, about the size of bricks, began to fall from the sky. The crew would shelter in place for about 30 minutes before it finally stopped. Afterwards, they would canvass the ship and found that the ice had left large dents in the wooden deck. The crew members did save a 2-pound chunk of ice by putting it in the boat's icebox and taking it back to shore to show proof they hadn't made up the story. Another weird story is that of a recent find known as America's underwater Stonehenge, which is exactly like it sounds, a structure at the bottom of the lake made of several stones that kinda resemble Stonehenge. One boater in particular has what looks like the petroglyph of a mastodon. However, this one has not had enough research yet. Then there's also just a massive amount of UFO sightings that go as far back as 1919, when people in the area reported seeing bright lights in the sky. Some of these witnesses even reported to see 2 large fireballs hit the lake, and the explosion shook cities along the lake shore. The New York Times would even report that it was 2 meteors. However, most skeptics still contend there's nothing supernatural about any of this, and each incident can be easily explained. And when you consider that there's probably over 1,500 shipwrecks setting at the bottom of Lake Michigan, then yeah, that makes the rest of the disappearances not seem rare or paranormal, especially when you consider the particularly rough winter storms that hit the area. Still, some chalk it up to portals or paranormal phenomena, or even ancient structures at the bottom of the lake which allegedly interfere with ship and aircraft instruments. October 15th, 2011, Riverdale, North Dakota. Ronald Johnson, who went by Ron, had long since made plans to go visit his son in Jamestown, about a 2.5-hour drive away, which would be followed up by a visit to his sister the following day on the 16th, in Valley City, some 4 hours away. The 74-year-old had recently dealt with some health issues, such as the ongoing issues with diabetes and recently undergoing a double bypass surgery, so it's no surprise that after visiting his son and sister, he had a doctor's appointment on Friday, the 17th, at Veterans Affairs Hospital in Fargo, about an hour from Valley City. After this, Ron planned to fly out to Needles, California, where he would spend the winter with his other sister. So with all these plans made, it would make what followed even more unusual, because when we go back to the 15th, when Ron was getting ready to visit his son, we find out he never made it. As the minutes ticked by, he got more and more worried, but since the visit was nothing more than a casual dropping in, and since Ron was going to be super busy over the next few days, he reasoned that he had just got busy and wasn't able to call him. However, he would call Ron, but he never answered, which made him worry more. By the next day, he knew Ron was going to visit his aunt in Valley City, so he contacted her, and again, she had not heard from him or seen him. His worries increased, but he still waited one more day, because he was certain his dad would not miss his medical appointment. So he waited and waited, and finally called the VA hospital, which confirmed he never showed up. In those 2 days, no sign of Ron ever popped up. Now his son was very worried and decided to make the 2.5-hour drive to Riverdale to check on him. After arriving to his apartment, the first thing he noticed was Ron's car was not there. He would go on into the apartment and look around and got even more confused. Ron was gone, but groceries were set out on the counter and a nearby suitcase was half packed. There were other items laying around, and it looked like he had been interrupted in the middle of packing for his trip. Now his son had seen too much and called authorities. A search began almost immediately, which included police as well as Civil Air Patrol. Some water searches were done as well, and there's not a lot of info on these water searches, but it's thought that Lake Sacagawea was the primary focus since the town sits right on its banks. They probably also searched the Missouri River, which runs nearby. Ron's children would then begin to drive back and forth over the route that Ron would have most likely taken to their homes, because they were afraid he had had a car accident or was stranded somewhere. but they didn't see him. Authorities, after a few days, were able to review his bank records, and they found something mysterious. On October 16th, the day he was supposed to be at his sister's, they found Ron's debit card had been used at a casino in his hometown. Now everyone was confused. His family knew Ron was a big-time gambler that spent a lot of time at the casino, but they never knew of him canceling plans with family to go gamble or to blow off doctor's appointments. Also, Newtown, where the casino was about an hour and a half from Riverdale where Ron lives, and it's in the opposite direction of where he was supposed to be going that day. His family was now even more worried. Had someone broke into his apartment, done something with Ron, stole his debit cards, and headed for the casino? Maybe it was even someone that had bumped into him at the casino before. Well, authorities would find out quickly, because when they got to the casino, they would ask to review the surveillance footage. Thanks to the bank records, they knew when and where to look for this person on camera, and sure enough, they got their man. Because right there on the film, at an ATM, was Ron. His family was even more confused now. Ron appeared okay, and he was not being forced to get money. Instead, he was getting it to gamble more. After these charges though, the card is never used again, nor is Ron or his vehicle ever spotted again. Detectives would try to trace his steps back a little bit further, and eventually found out that Ron had been spotted in Newtown the early morning hours of the 16th, so they assumed he most likely went there on the 15th instead of going to his son's. There aren't many routes from Riverdale to Newtown, and the ones that do exist are very rural and not heavily trafficked. Some have speculated that after leaving Newtown and headed back to Riverdale, he could have crashed into the water. There were a few ponds and a couple of lakes next to the road on the trip back. There's even a good-sized bridge he would have to cross over to get back to Riverdale. And if he had been up all night gambling and attempted to drive home tired, it's possible he could have got ran off the road and into the water. It's even possible he had a medical emergency. Yet, the car hasn't been found yet, if that's the case. The second and less believed theory is he ran off to start a new life. But considering he made a bunch of plans with family and had so many health issues, that doesn't seem logical. Which brings us to the gambling again. If he had found himself in trouble with gambling issues, it is possible he left and didn't want to put his family at risk. But there's no evidence that he had any gambling debts. Sticking with the gambling theory, others have wondered if maybe he won big that night and someone followed him out to the car and then followed him somewhere before eventually robbing and killing him. But again, there's no proof of this, and I'm sure security cameras at the casino would have picked this up. January 29th, 1925, Ohio State University. A young student named Timothy McCarthy would catch a cold and was feeling pretty rough. He decided to go to the health service office where the university students went when they needed medicine. It was here that the doctor wrote out a prescription for capsules, which were then filled with aspirin and quinine, which was the standard remedy for the time. This prescription would then be filled by the College of Pharmacy's dispensary. But shortly after Timothy took the medicine, he began to feel worse. He got terrible pain and cramps throughout his body. Luckily, he would lay down to rest, and after a few days of misery, he would recover. 2 days later, two more young students, 20-year-old Harold Gillig and 21-year-old Charles Hulls, would also go get medicine from the same dispensary, and just like Timothy, both young men would instantly get gravely ill after ingesting the medicine. Harold Gillig would pull through, while Charles would die after suffering violent convulsions. Campus doctors, who I imagine didn't do an autopsy, simply ruled that Charles had died of tetanus and moved on. However, the following day, another student, David Puskin, would go get cold medicine from the dispensary. 20 minutes after taking the capsule, he was dead, and the doctors for the university, who still must have not wanted to do an autopsy, ruled that David had succumbed to meningitis. But this time, they made the wise decision to put all of his friends in quarantine. 2 days later, another student, George Thompson, would go get cold medicine from the dispensary. He immediately fell ill and was so sick that Ohio State finally had to admit something was going on. They would do an analysis on the contents of George's stomach and found that he had swallowed strychnine. Campus doctors, who were embarrassed at this point, tried to say that meningitis and tetanus were easily confused with poisoning. Shortly after this, 4 other students would get poisoned by the code medicine, but all survived. Now it was obvious, all this poison was coming from the code medicine, and there was no way it was put in there by mistake, since it was only a few capsules. Not to mention, strychnine could be easily differentiated from quinine. Ohio State now realized they had a serial poisoner, someone who lived or worked on campus, and police were brought in. The obvious thought was that the killer worked in the dispensary, but they weren't sure how this person could have tampered with the capsules. All the medicines were made under the close supervision of faculty members of the College of Pharmacy. The 64 students who had been working before the poisonings were all questioned, and nearly all of them were baffled, claiming that there was no way it could be done under such close supervision, except for one young woman who admitted after filling aspirin and quinine capsules so many times over the past 2 years, she stopped bothering to ask for a supervisor to come over, pointing out the quinine and aspirin were stored in the same place, so a mistake could not be possible, but it opened the door for someone to have done it intentionally. They did take the remaining stock of medicine and found that all the other capsules were normal, except one, and, unsurprisingly, every student who still had code medicine they had gotten from the dispensary took it to the detectives, and one of these again was found with strychnine, enough to kill someone 4 times over. Taking into consideration the number of students who had been sickened, they calculated that of the 300 capsules recently made, 8 contained poison. The state pharmacy board looked at recent legal sales of strychnine, but found nothing suspicious. The dean of the College of Pharmacy did do his own investigation and found that in the back of a shelf in the chemical storeroom sat a small bottle of strychnine. However, it was nearly full and covered in dust, and had not been used in a long time. It ended up belonging to someone in the faculty that had used it twice in classes long ago. Before long, detectives did circle in on one suspect, a pharmacy student named Neilson Rosenberg, who admitted to have bought strychnine tablets off campus to use as a stimulant to help him study. As insane as that sounds, yes, you could buy tiny doses of strychnine to be used as a stimulant back then. He admitted to keeping it at the campus laboratory, and it would have been easily accessible. However, other students claimed to have never seen this bottle, and Rosenberg himself said he had no idea what happened to it. However, he was able to convince detectives he was not responsible, and they moved on. Another odd person that came into this was student Louis Fish, who admitted giving David the capsule that killed him. He explained they were friends, so when he came to the dispensary, he was the one to fill the prescription for him. He would confess that he had went into the pharmacy without authority to get the medicine. He had at first lied to investigators because he didn't want to be mixed up in a murder investigation. He was also the first student to work in the dispensary the week the capsules were circulated. Furthermore, he suddenly left campus and went home to Canton, 100 miles away. As soon as he arrived home, he turned back and drove right back to school. When asked about this, he said he didn't want to stick around in Canton. He was arrested only to be released the following day. It's never been released by police as to why Fish or Rosenberg were dropped from their investigation. And that's pretty much it. The case was never solved. No one knows who was behind it or why, but the main theory is that there was only one person who was targeted and the other poisonings were used as a smokescreen. Sometimes, when a person goes missing, there's not many clues or evidence to even give the general idea of what could have happened. In fact, many cases we looked at in the past fit this criteria, but sometimes it's even stranger, like when 2 people simply vanish into thin air, leaving only one mysterious clue. March 26, 2003, Alderson, Oklahoma, 62-year-old Rodger Osborn and his friend and co-worker, Rickey Kutej, would get together to do some odd jobs at Rodger's garage. Now, the 2 men actually lived in the Oklahoma City metro area, but the garage that Rodger owned sat out in the little town of McAllister. The men most likely reached the garage early that Saturday morning, but later that day, someone came by to see the 2, as both men were known to trade with people out in the area. And when this unnamed person pulled up, they found the garage was wide open, with neither Rodger or Rickey seen about. This person would leave, but made sure to call the police because something just felt off. The The police would send someone out to look, and they found a weird scene. First, they found a bulldozer, which appeared to be in the middle of being worked on by the two men. Next to the bulldozer was a ladder, which had been knocked over, and near this ladder was a small amount of blood. The policeman naturally assumed that one of the men was using the ladder to work on something up high on the bulldozer, when suddenly there was an accident causing the ladder to fall over with one of the men. The scene only had a little blood, and the officer assumed that one of the men drove the other to the hospital. In fact, both men's vehicles that they used to get to the garage were still there. However, it's believed they left in Rodger's Dodge Ram 3500, which he had at the garage. Detectives did follow up with numerous hospitals and medical facilities to find out that no one had checked in that day with a head injury, and that's pretty much it. The two men have never been seen again, nor has the truck. There's not much on this one, and not many theories either. Detectives did check the backgrounds of the men, and neither one of them were involved in any criminal activities, and they never had been, and they were also able to rule out robbery since nothing was taken. The main theory then became that they ran off the road into the water when one was taking the other to the hospital. However, the YouTube channel Adventures with Purpose, who search bodies of water for missing people and crashed vehicles, actually did a video on this disappearance. They searched all the bodies of water on the short route between the garage and the hospital they would have went to, and they found nothing. 2 decades later, and there is still no clue as to what happened to Rickey and Rodger. George Gorman was a 25-year-old veteran pilot of World War II who would, after the war, become the second lieutenant of the North Dakota National Guard, and on October 1st, 1948, Gorman was participating in a cross-country flight with other National Guard pilots. His flight would arrive at Fargo at around 8:30 p.m. When coming in, the other pilots would safely land at Fargo's Hector Airport, but Gorman, he decided to take advantage of the clear, cloudless conditions to get some nighttime flying in. He would even fly over a stadium around 9 p.m. where a high school football game was taking place, and then at one point, noticed a small airplane some 500 feet below him. Other than that, it was just a clear night, perfect for flying. However, this would shortly change, because after he noticed the other airplane under him, Gorman would see another object to the west, and it appeared to be a blinking light. At 9:07 p.m., Gorman would contact the control tower at Hector Airport and ask if there was any other traffic in the area other than him and the plane below him. The tower responded that there was not, and then the air tower would contact the pilot of the other aircraft, A.D. Cannon, and Cannon confirmed there was a lit object flying to the west. Gorman would then tell the watchtower he was going to pursue the craft to determine its identity. He would put the aircraft into full power, but soon realized the object was going too fast for him in a straight run, so he would try to cut the object off by making turns. He started with a right turn and approached the object head-on at 5,000 feet and watched it fly over him at 500 feet. He described it as a simple ball of light, about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. He also noted that it increased in speed and the light stopped blinking and grew brighter. After this, he lost sight of the object, but he saw it again when it appeared to have made a 180-degree turn and was coming towards him. It then made a sudden vertical climb, to which Gordon would also make the steep climb, but his aircraft stalled at 14,000 feet, and the object was still 2,000 feet above him. It made one more head-on pass before breaking off and moving towards the airport. It's then that the air traffic controller, L.D. Jensen, would watch it through binoculars. Although he could not see any form or shape around the light, Cannon, the guy flying the other plane, landed and went to the tower to watch the object with the air traffic controller. Gorman followed the object 25 miles west of Fargo before it finally got too far out of visual range, and he broke off the chase at 9:27 p.m. and flew back to the airport. This would become one of the most important early UFO encounters in history. Gorman's account has been reprinted for decades in numerous books and documentaries about the case. The Air Force would also be there within hours to investigate. One thing they did early on was use a Geiger counter to test for radiation, and they found Gorman's aircraft was way more radioactive than other aircraft that had not been flown in days. This led to speculation that whatever he was following was atomic powered. They also did something you don't hear often, and they ruled out weather balloon right away. However, they quickly came back to the Geiger reading and clarified that since the plane was flying high in the atmosphere, it was less shielded from radiation, thus ruling out an atomic-powered object. In addition, the Air Weather Service revealed that they had released a weather balloon that day and that it would have been in Fargo by 8:50 p.m., and by 9 p.m., it would have been where Gorman and the other pilots seen it. They also stated that the incredible movements that Gorman was seeing was an illusion created by his own movements. They also believed that once the weather balloon was out of sight, Gorman could have thought the planet Jupiter was the UFO. However, some UFO researchers disagree, of course, and claim that there was a cover-up by the Air Force, while other UFO researchers claim that the Air Force investigation was right and that the Gorman sighting is one of the most overrated UFO cases out there. Others claim that it was a top-secret aircraft or maybe even a Soviet weapon. Lake Leelanau, sometimes known as Carp Lake, is actually two adjacent lakes that are located in Leelanau County, Michigan. The lakes are rather unremarkable except for one thing. It is the home of a strange cryptid that was spotted in the early 20th century. The Leelanau Lake Monster is a water cryptid that surprisingly has never been associated with the prototypical plesiosaur-type cryptids like Nessie or Ogopogo. According to the records, this creature first appeared in Lake Leelanau after a dam was built in the late 1800s. That dam was made to provide power for the Leland sawmill, which effectively cut off the lake's largest outlet, and according to the sources, also sealed this animal in with it. After the dam was erected, the water level rose about 11 feet, flooding a large portion of the land and creating a marsh-like environment. This area is where the cryptid was said to thrive. There would be numerous reports of the beast in the later years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, but it's the report in 1910 that most of our details about the animal come out. It all starts on a summer day when a teenager named William Gautier, who came from a very prominent family in the area, would take his rowboat out to fish for perch among the shallow reeds along the shores. After fishing a while and not having any luck, he decided to roll on down to a section of the lake he never fished before. He would pass several dead cedar trees which were sticking haphazardly out of the water, so he decided to tie his boat to one of these stumps while he continued to fish. He finally chose a tree in which he described as being around 5 feet tall and inches wide and pulled next to it. He would get the rope ready and gently hang it from the tree when, just as the rope touched the branch, two huge eyes suddenly opened up at face level, horrifying the teen. He would stare at it a few seconds, trying to make sense of what had happened, and suddenly, the animal dove beneath his boat and swam away. He noted the creature's immense length, stating he could see the submerged head of the beast on the far side of the boat, while its tail was still in the air on the other side. It then escaped into the depths. Considering he did not recognize the stump until its eyes opened, indicates that this animal had incredible camouflage, which allowed it to hide in the stump-studded environment. The whole event was said to shake up William so bad that he avoided fishing on the lake for many years, and there were many people who were said to have seen the same thing but never came forward to make an official report because they feared their ridicule. However, it's been many years now since the last reported sighting of Leelanau, and most cryptid researchers believe whatever was trapped there after the dam was built has long since died. But the original question remains, what did William see? Of course, there's always the possibility that he was just telling a tall tale, or maybe exaggerated something that did happen. Others point out that it could have been a misidentification. Maybe it was a carp. They can get pretty huge, and I mean, it was nicknamed Carp Lake. In fact, about 50 years later, on June 6, 1963, the Leelanau Enterprise Tribune would document a strange encounter by a young man on the shores of Lake Leelanau, where he seen an unknown water animal with a huge head, about a foot wide, with two large protruding eyes. It would pop out of the water, go down, and then resubmerge in a different spot, and it did this for a while. He estimated that it was 10 feet in length, and it was suggested by the paper that what he really seen was a giant muskie or maybe even a large sturgeon, which could be exactly what William had spotted. Others think it was some kind of turtle. Browning Hill, or known by the locals as Browning Mountain, is a hill located in Brown County near the town of Story, Indiana. It lies within the Hoosier National Forest and is designated as a special management area due to the relatively undisturbed old-growth forest that covers it. But why it is here on our mystery iceberg is because of an unexplained field of limestone boulders that have been placed here, which has led to the nickname Indiana Stonehenge. The stones are massive, and there are many. It's like a group of giant box-shaped rocks, some as big as a car. Most of them are strewn about somewhat randomly, but others are arranged in a circle, like it was some kind of ancient sacred meeting site. Certain stones are even laid out to line up perfectly to the Earth's equinox. They weigh many tons and would have had to have been dragged up the hill, which is 928 feet high. But the strangest part about all this is there is no limestone in the area. The closest limestone is found 90 miles away, meaning whoever done this put a lot of effort into it, dragging several ton stones over 90 miles and then up a 900-foot hill using old or possibly ancient technology, which would be a challenge. So what are the theories? Well, there are a few. Of course, the big one is that a local Native American tribe that once lived in the area may have hauled them over the large distance to build a site for ceremonies, or it was possible even an ancient civilization done it, possibly with the intent of building an outdoor temple to set atop of the hill. Then there's the suggestion that they were brought in by settlers to use as a cabin's foundation, while a more out there theory is that a glacier simply dumped them off while rolling through the area millennia ago. December 19th, 1949, Mauston, Wisconsin. The day would start like any other for the Bryant family. Raymond, the family patriarch, was a truck driver and would go out on his run to Chicago, while mother Opal would leave for work at a nearby garment factory. Their oldest child, Sharon, was at school, while the remaining children would stay at the Bryant home to be taken care of by their grandparents, Casper and Helen Halverson. These children were 5-year-old Forrest, 4-year-old Rickey Jean, or Jeannie as she went by, and 18-month-old Elizabeth. But this day that started off normal would quickly change into a nightmare, because around 3 p.m., a horrible fire would break out in the farmhouse, which would force the family to flee. Now this is the mostly agreed on version of events up to this point, but from here we get two very different stories of what happens next. According to Forrest, the 5-year-old brother, his grandmother Helen would take him, Elizabeth, and Jeannie outside. She would tell Forrest to stay with his two sisters while she ran in to get their grandfather. Forrest, while standing there watching his grandmother run into the burning home, would then be surprised to see a woman pull up next to the home in what he described as a fancy car. This woman would then get out, and he described her as being tall with blonde hair. The woman would tell Forrest to run to the neighbor's house for help, so Forrest took off running, but he was headed towards the neighbor closest to the house. That's when this strange woman would tell him not to go to that neighbor's because their phone wasn't working, but to instead go to the neighbor on down the road. So Forrest, thinking this adult was here to help, did as she said. He rushed to the neighbor further down the road and asked for help, and soon rushed back to where he had left his sisters. And when he got there, Jeannie was gone. However, the grandmother, Helen Halverson, would tell a totally different story. She would claim she took Forrest and Elizabeth outside and then ran back in to rescue Jeannie but found no sign of her. She then put a ladder up to the second floor window where she claimed she carried out her handicapped husband back down the ladder. Sharon, the oldest sister, was at school during these events and would be picked up by her grandmother later on, who told her that Jeannie was now an angel and to never mention her name again. There is also a third account on this that came from the neighbor that Forrest went to get. This was a woman named Irene Carlson who rushed to the scene, then put Forrest and Elizabeth in the car and rushed inside to find Jeannie. But when she went in, Helen, the grandmother, was collecting canned goods and simply told her Jeannie was gone. Irene kept looking for her as she cried, and Helen eventually told her to stop looking and help by getting the fur coat out. And then strangely, she later told Irene that Jeannie was not even in the home. She had been at relatives. Regardless, the fire department showed up and put out the blaze and searched for Jeannie but found nothing. One firefighter even claimed to have heard screams come from the blaze. At one point, bone fragments were found, but they were not human. Her father Raymond, along with the volunteers, searched the home and found nothing, but he still did not believe she died in the fire. The siblings would eventually state that they were told never to mention her name again. There was no death certificate for Jeannie, and there was never a funeral, although her mom did try to get her a headstone many years after the fact. Even stranger, Opal and Raymond would eventually divorce, and she would take Elizabeth to Washington, while Sharon and Forrest lived with Raymond. Opal would sometimes go to Wisconsin to visit her kids. She would then take them to Minnesota to visit relatives, and while there, Opal herself would disappear for days and not tell anyone where she was going. Over 30 years later, in 1985, the remaining 3 siblings met up to compare notes and put the story together. So much of it did not make sense. Why were they told not to speak of Jeannie? Why was the neighbor told she was with other relatives? Who was the woman that pulled up? Was it just possible when Opal was dropping them off at relatives in Minnesota and then disappearing for days, she was actually going to visit Jeannie? There was also some financial oddities that occurred. The mother and grandmother had no money before the fire, and they had no insurance on the house either. Yet, they had a lot of money after the fire, and actually, right before the money, the grandmother had gotten that fur coat. In 2005, the sibling gave the story to the sheriff's office, who officially reopened the case, but unfortunately, all the records had been destroyed in a flood in 2000. Fast forward until 2018, and a cousin of theirs that was close to their mother would tell the siblings straight up that Jeannie did not die in the fire, but she never elaborated any further. There's a couple of theories on this one. Some have speculated that Jeannie was not Raymond's biological child, and they possibly prearranged all this to happen, and they gave Jeannie to the mysterious woman to raise, or maybe to be taken to be raised by other family members. Others think she may have been sold, which explained the money that they had afterwards. Another theory is that this woman was driving by at the time to see the house burning down and grabbed the child and ran off, intending to give her a good life and raise her as her own. But it seems likely she wouldn't leave the 18-month-old Elizabeth just standing in the yard alone. And did she really know that the neighbor's phone wasn't working, or did she just say that to get Forrest to go further away? However, most authorities still believe she died in the fire. Still, I'd like to know what you think. What happened to Jeannie? Falls City, Nebraska, sometime in the autumn of 1956, a man who would go by the pseudonym John Hanks would have a disturbing encounter that would haunt him for several years. John and his family had just returned from an outing they attended earlier that day, and they had just unloaded their car and went into the house, while John remained outside as he began to put his work equipment into his pickup truck for work the next day. As he was doing this, he noticed a kite flying in the distance about 3 blocks from his house. He continued to watch and noticed the kite was drawing closer. John naturally assumed that the kite had gotten away from whoever was flying it, and he paid no more attention. But a few minutes later, it got within 1 block of where John was standing, and it was here that he finally noticed that this was not a kite at all. Instead, John noticed a human-like form with wings. As it got closer, he could see this thing's face, which he described as very frightening, almost demonic. It had very large blue eyes that were watery, and they were shaped and placed on its face sorta like a horse's eyes. The skin was like tan leather. It was very wrinkled and seemed to overlap in folds. John would estimate that it would get within 25 feet and about 15 foot above him, and looking at this strange cryptid, he noted that it was a good 8 to 9 feet tall. As he continued to watch, the creature wobbled and almost fell to the ground, before recovering and flying straight towards John, who found that he could not move, like he was paralyzed with fear. The creature would pass over him, and he would note that its wings looked like they were made from polished aluminum, and that they had a grid-like appearance on the top side. The underside had 4 to 5 colored lights about 4 inches in diameter. The lights closest to his body on either side glowed blue, then a yellow, then an orange, and finally a red light out toward each wingtip. The wings were about 15 feet long from tip to tip, and were about 2 feet wide next to the body, but 3 feet wide next to the tip. He then noted the wings appeared to be attached by some kind of shoulder harness, which seemed to have a breastplate of some sort with dials on it, and he seemed to touch and move these dials. As it passed overhead, he heard a sound like air hissing from the rear of the wing as it flew off into the distance and disappeared behind a group of trees blocks away. John estimated the whole event took between 8 and 10 minutes. For the next 23 years, he stated he would have nightmares about the creature, which led to lack of sleep, and he ended up becoming a workaholic. Also, he could be too distracted to think about the encounter. There's not a lot of theories on this one, but let's start with the obvious. It could have all been a hoax, or a tall tale started by this person who went under a fake name. Maybe that's why he went under a fake name. Others suggest that if it was real, it could have been a fallen angel or maybe a demon, but I kinda wonder if it could have been an early secret prototype of a jetpack. April 7th, 1993, Aberdeen, South Dakota. 42-year-old Monica Wickre, or known to her friends as Mona, had plans to go to a nearby bar with friends to have drinks. Mona was a very outgoing person who loved to dance as well as sing, and she was noted by many to have a beautiful singing voice. Now her husband, on the other hand, was quite the opposite. He was a homebody, but this worked out perfect for them, and that night he would give her a ride to the bar to spend time with her friends. And as the night began to wind down, Mona decided it was time to go, and she planned on just getting a ride with a couple she knew, and this couple would bring along another man from the bar that they knew, because they were giving him a ride back to his car, as he had parked somewhere else. Now Mona did not know or had never met this man before, which would be odd because of what happened next. The couple would take this man to his car first, since he had not parked far away, and then planned to drive Mona home. However, when they got to the spot to drop this man off, Mona decided to get out and go with him. Now, this was only the beginning of a very sketchy and weird mystery, but we must first start with Mona's large family who lived on a reservation. She actually had 9 siblings, and she was very close to them. It would be them that after 19 days without contact with Mona that they began to worry, because it was unusual to not hear from her because she was so close to them. So they decided to call Mona's husband to find out if she was okay, and I can only imagine their shock when they found out that Mona had not made it back home since that night she went to the bar almost 3 weeks ago, and her husband, yeah, he never bothered to call the police. So her family did, and filed a missing persons case. Searches were made throughout the area, and detectives interviewed friends and neighbors, but they were already 3 weeks behind, and they didn't make much progress. Sadly, 2 months later, on June 16th, Mona's clothed, badly decomposed body was found in the James River just outside Aberdeen by a passerby in a canoe. She was identified through dental records, and unfortunately, a cause of death could not be determined. However, detectives suspected foul play and treated her case as homicide. There have been multiple suspects over the years, and there's actually multiple suspects now, but the biggest problem with this investigation has always been that 3-week period, which opens up other questions about her husband. One of the investigators on this case, though, has said there might have been times when Mona didn't return home immediately, so maybe this was something that did not alert her husband since she had done it before. But let's go back to that bar first. Now this bar was called the Body Shop, and it was actually connected to a strip club, and it was widely known to attract a rough crowd, as there were frequent fights in the parking lot, and this bar was also not in the middle of town. It was actually on the outskirts, not in walkable distance of the other bars. Because of this, and because of her husband's actions, some have postulated that Mona could have been engaged in sex work. However, that's never been confirmed by police. Another unconfirmed tidbit I came across which could really change the investigation, was on the 17th, an off-duty police officer reportedly seen Mona at the Aberdeen Mall, which was just 8 days before her body would have been found in the river, and just 10 days since she had went to the bar. Of course, that would completely change the timeline if true, but I was unable to find if police could ever confirm it. Which brings us back to the obvious suspect, the unknown man that hitched a ride with Mona and the couple. Did Mona really leave with him? If she did, why? What happened once she did get into his vehicle? Well, investigators have spoke to this couple, as well as this man, whom they have never publicly identified, and unfortunately, whatever details came from those interviews have never been released. But since there's never been an arrest made, I can only assume they don't have enough evidence. Of course, maybe this unknown man is not responsible. What about her husband, who seemingly did not care she had been gone for 3 weeks? Or what about the police officer who seen her at the mall? Who was she with then? Hopefully, these questions can be answered soon. June 9th, 1907, Waseca, Minnesota. The beginnings of an unusual mystery would start to unfold. It is at a railway station when some people who were about to aboard a train would find a man laying down on the platform. He was clearly experiencing a medical emergency. Actually, he appeared to have had a stroke and fell to the ground, leaving his head bruised. He was quickly taken to a hospital where he regained consciousness, yet his right side from toe to cheek was completely paralyzed. The man was unable to speak except for one word, he, and he can only write 3 letters, J.C.R, which was believed to be his initials. Since no one had a way of identifying him, they didn't know what to do, but eventually, a charitable German family started caring for him, and a Dr. W.A. Chamberlain would begin working with him. He would ask J.C.R. questions, to who would then nod yes or no for answers. And after asking almost endless questions, the doctor gathered he was getting on the train to go west, and that he had came from San Francisco to New York and was on his way back, and that the most surprising thing was he belonged to the Navy, and at one point carried official dispatches. The doctor would push for more, and although J.C.R. did not know what ship he had been on, the doctor would ask if he had been north, and J.C.R. turned up his coat collar and shivered. He was then able to discern that this man had been on a ship in 1902 or 1903, somewhere in the Arctic. The superintendent of the hospital would then contact the Navy Department at Washington, yet they were not able to help. His picture would then be published in newspapers, asking for people to help in identifying him. Enter the Caldwells, a curious family. James Caldwell was a wealthy rancher living in North Dakota, and he was an interesting, or sketchy person, depending on how you look at it. He lost all of his fortune originally in the Chicago Fire of 1871, before starting over in North Dakota. His sister's children died in a fire in one of his sheds. An employee of his vanished, while another one died mysteriously, and that deceased employee's wife also drowned. And then James's wife died as well. Now James had a son named Jay, who left his father and ranch because the two didn't get along, and of course, James had a reputation for being an awfully angry person anyways. In fact, it was rumored James had played a role in his son's disappearance. But what does this all have to do with J.C.R.? Well, James's 2 sisters, who would be Jay's aunts, heard this story and went to visit J.C.R. thinking it might be Jay. However, after meeting him, they decided he was a bit too tall to be their nephew, and they left. But for some bizarre reason, a nurse at that hospital believed J.C.R. was really Jay Caldwell, and she snuck J.C.R. out of the hospital and to the ranch, where his father James 100% dismissed any chance of it being Jay. However, at least 100 local residents, and more importantly, Jay's own sister, said that J.C.R. was indeed Jay Caldwell, her long-lost brother, and decided to care for him. However, it was later found out that J.C.R. had been found in the train station 2 weeks before Jay was reported missing. But that's not the end of this weird story, because 12 years later, in 1919, a woman in St. Paul, Minnesota, named Mrs. Lambert Blue, came forward insisting that J.C.R. was her former husband, James Harris, who went missing on a fishing trip and never returned, and this was the same year that J.C.R. was found. However, this could come from the fact that Mrs. Blue and her daughter Dorothy stood to inherit $250,000 from their husband/father, because after Harris disappeared and was presumed dead, the stock that he owned in a merchandising company went back to that business, and now it was believed that they wanted J.C.R. to be Harris so they would inherit that money and his Florida mansion. However, everybody seen through it, and they were not allowed to take J.C.R. home, and the records after this are kinda spotty, but it seems nobody ever identified him, and the last reports are that he ended up being a vagrant beggar in North Dakota. So yeah, pretty sad. But do you think he could have been Jay Caldwell, or James Harris, or someone else altogether? Let me know in the comment section below. Some of the earliest European travelers to go through North Dakota were unsurprisingly in search of gold, attracted by the stories of the rich mines in Montana and Idaho, which drew prospectors from all over. And it brings us to our man of mystery, Dr. William Denton Dibb. In 1864, Dr. Dibb would leave Minnesota as part of a wagon train headed for the gold fields of Idaho, and in doing so, would be the first ever physician in the Dakotas. And while they were on their way, the doctor and the rest of the wagon train would notice something odd about the area they were passing through. This area, near Deep Creek in Bowman County, showed signs of a previous mining effort. They would get out and set up camp on a nearby hill and begin their search. Dibb would find an abandoned mine shaft that he would go in and check out, and to his shock, he discovered a gold vein. There was so much gold that he and the rest of the party would be rich for life. As the source claimed, there were several hundred pounds of gold, and this may be true, because accounts from the people that knew Dr. Dibb would note how he all of a sudden appeared very wealthy. The way he dressed, traveled, and lived all showed that he was now rich. But here's where the stories diverge. According to one version, Dibb would work the mine for several months, and once he had enough, he went to Montana, living out the rest of his life there and never once returning to the mine. While other versions of the story state that he, along with the other miners, would conceal the opening to the mine and then go to Montana, and they would return later on and were unable to find the entrance. This story mainly comes from the journals of Dr. Dibb himself, which were pieced together in the early 1900s, and it's been told over and over, and of course, the story has been added on to over time, changing the facts. For example, some stories actually state that it was a silver mine, not gold. The Minnesota Historical Society would examine copies of the journal in 1923 and determined that it was most likely a hoax, and that the story was created much later on by someone other than Dr. Dibb. And considering there is no record of anyone ever mining that area prior to their arrival, well, it seems like it may just be a hoax. However, a few years after the Dr. Dibb story, a man named William Gay would find small grains of gold from a huge deposit that had been washed down the Grand River, which was only 29 miles away from the deposit Dibb was said to have found. So is it possible that there is a gold mine in Bowman County, North Dakota, just waiting to be found again? Hey y'all, this is the end of this installment of the Midwest Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.